On a cold March morning in the mountains of North Georgia, a hiker made a discovery so unsettling that they immediately went searching for another person just to make sure their eyes weren't playing tricks on them. At the top of this mountain, two 19-year-old twin brothers were lying side by side, dead. Just days earlier, those same brothers had been talking about their future. They were in school, working towards careers, building a clothing brand together, and planning a birthday trip. They were doing what they'd been doing their entire lives, and that was always sticking together. But before investigators had even finished processing the crime scene, an explanation for what happened was already beginning to take shape. This explanation shocked the family, and it's an explanation that they still refuse to believe. The more that they looked at the timeline, the evidence, and the final hours of the twins' lives, the more questions seemed to appear. Why were they on top of that mountain that nobody knew that they had ever visited? What happened during those final hours before they died? And why does this case continue to divide investigators, attorneys, and the people who knew these young men the best? This is the story of Qaadir and Naazir Lewis. Welcome to the True Crime Nurse, everybody. My name is Kat, and I'm a registered nurse who loves all things nursing and true crime. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell before you go. All right, my friends, let's get into today's case. Naazir Rahim Lewis came into this world 5 minutes before his brother, Qaadir Malik Lewis, on April 5th, 2005. From that moment forward, the twins moved together as a unit. Naazir and Qaadir were identical, and they had the same face, build, and beautiful broad smile, but if you knew them well enough, you could easily tell them apart. Qaadir usually wore his hair in twists, and Naazir either had braids or a buzz cut. Their family called them the ding-dong twins, like the sound of a doorbell chiming twice, because they were so close and always together. If you heard that first chime, then you knew the second one was coming. The boys were born and raised in Georgia, and they grew up in Lawrenceville and Gwinnett County, surrounded by their large family. They lived with their father, Tyrese Lewis, and their stepmom, Karini, and they attended Collins Hill High School until they graduated in May of 2023. After graduation, Qaadir enrolled in aviation maintenance school to learn how to work on aircrafts, and Naazir enrolled as a technical college student to study car repairs. The boys shared a black Nissan Altima, and Naazir enjoyed maintaining and taking care of their car, especially because he was going to school for it. Unfortunately, their car would break down all the time, so Naazir got plenty of experience working on it outside of school. The twins had dreams of becoming entrepreneurs someday, and they talked a lot about starting an athletic clothing line. They even chose the name for it, and that was Overkill. They chose this because they associated it with excellence, going further than required, and doing more than enough. Naazir and Qaadir had plans to go on a cruise to celebrate their 20th birthdays, so they had all types of exciting things going on in their life to look forward to in the near future. The boys were also obsessed with things like anime and video games, specifically the Mortal Kombat games. They had a love for animated TV shows, The Color Red, and even the Disney movie The Princess and the Frog. It may seem surprising, but the two 19-year-old boys both loved the classic hand-drawn Disney princess movies. Their Aunt Antoinette Lewis joked and said that the boys were nerdy, but she said this in the most loving and warm way, of course. They even cosplayed on the back deck of their home in Lawrenceville, dressing up as different kinds of anime characters with different anime-styled swords, because they were fully committed to the bit. Naazir was also in a serious long-distance relationship with his girlfriend who lived in Boston, Massachusetts for about a year when today's story takes place. He went to Boston to go see her in December of 2024, and during that visit, he opened up about some stresses that were going on back home. He said that he was struggling with home life and financial responsibilities because his dad was actually suffering with some health problems at the time. His girlfriend said that they were very happy together, though, and that they were planning on building their future together despite what he was going through at the time. They planned a follow-up trip to Boston on March 7th, but this was the last time that Naazir's girlfriend would ever see him again. On the morning of Saturday, March 8th, 2025, a University of North Georgia student went to hike up Bell Mountain. Bell Mountain is in Towns County, Georgia, which is 5 miles from the Hiawassee Town Square near the North Carolina state line. This is not an easy hike, and this area also happens to be a sundown town, which we've talked about quite a bit in other cases, unfortunately. When this student hiker reached the top of this mountain, they found something that stopped them completely in their tracks. They were in such shock that they went and found another person who was also at the mountain hiking that morning and asked that person to come help verify what they were looking at too. What both of these hikers saw was tragic. There were two young men found lying on their backs at the top of the mountain side by side. They both had visible gunshot wounds to the head, and it was clear that it was already too late to intervene or even try to save them. Their legs were straight, their arms were outstretched, and the scene around them was eerily quiet. At about 11:05 a.m., the Towns County 911 Center received a call regarding what the hikers had just discovered. The Towns County Sheriff's Office responded and immediately knew that the scene required more than their department could handle, so they called in the Georgia Bureau of Investigations, or GBI. The boys were immediately identified through their belongings, including a plane ticket that was still in Naazir's pocket. The family was immediately contacted, and they were in complete shock and disbelief at the loss of not one but both of their boys, and they immediately wanted to know who did this to them. The GBI released a statement on the following morning, March 9, 2025, saying that both men were found with gunshot wounds, which the GBI believed at the time was a situation where one of the brothers killed the other and then took their own life. This went out to the public the morning after the boys were found, and this was news to the Lewis family. They were not told about the GBI's theory before it was released publicly. The family said that they knew right away that that was not true, but they still had so many questions. How did they end up in the mountains? They didn't even hike. They'd never even been there before. The boys had never even so much as talked about Bell Mountain. The family wanted answers, and they deserved them. On March 18th, so 10 days after the bodies were found, the GBI announced an arrest connected to the case, but not connected to the deaths of Naazir and Qaadir. Scott Curlin was a volunteer firefighter in Towns County and a resident of Hiawassee. He was charged with misdemeanor obstruction because he showed up at the Bell Mountain crime scene, took pictures of the bodies of Qaadir and Naazir Lewis, and then he shared those photos publicly. The GBI also addressed this to the public because this was highly concerning, and it seemed that they wanted to get ahead of any possible crooked investigation theories. Before we get into the full investigation, though, I do want to spend some time talking about the autopsies. The GBI medical examiner completed the autopsies pretty quickly following the March 8th discovery, but the official ruling was held for additional forensic testing until May 21st, 2025. What ended up being released shocked everybody, especially the Lewis family. Both deaths were ruled as self-inflicted, so their initial theory that one of them had killed the other first and then themselves was completely shut down. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation's 300-page case file confirmed that both brothers died from gunshot wounds to the right side of their heads and that they were fired from very close range. Close contact gunshot wounds usually leave soot inside the wounds, burns around the edges, sometimes even an imprint of the gun on the skin. When a gun is fired that closely but not touching the skin, we can expect to see stippling. Stippling looks like tiny pepper-like marks caused by the gunpowder going into the skin or hitting it. These patterns help investigators figure out how far away the gun was when it was fired. To do this, forensic examiners will test that same weapon with the same ammunition at different distances to compare the results to the patterns found around the wound. This allows them to estimate the distance between the muzzle and the skin at the time of the shooting, which could be the difference between homicide or not. A gunshot wound to the right temple is consistent with either a right-handed person shooting themselves or someone else staging it to look as if the victim had done this to themselves. The weapon used was a Springfield Garrison .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol, and it was found between Naazir's legs, plus 2 spent shell casings were recovered nearby Naazir only. Now, the temporal bone located at the side of the skull above the ear is one of the thinnest areas of the skull. It provides less protection than the forehead or maybe even the back of the head would. A .45 caliber bullet fired into this area at close range causes devastating injuries. The damage occurs in several ways, all at the same time. First, the bullet physically destroys tissue along the path that it travels through the brain. Second, the force of the impact creates a powerful pressure wave that moves throughout the brain too. Because the brain is mostly comprised of water and it's enclosed inside of the skull, that pressure wave can damage areas far beyond the bullet's path. Third, the bullet creates a cavity as it passes through the tissue, temporarily forcing brain tissue to come outward and causing even more destruction like bleeding internally. Together, these effects cause catastrophic damage to the parts of the brain that control consciousness, breathing, heart function, and other vital processes. Injuries like this are unsurvivable. Loss of consciousness occurs immediately, and any intentional movement stops almost instantly. One of the most important and controversial findings in this case, though, was that the GBI's conclusion was that the brothers had both fired the weapon. There was one gun, 2 rounds fired, 2 shell casings, and 2 deceased brothers. This is one of the main reasons that the police felt that the boys both took their own lives. We also know that when a gun is fired, it releases microscopic particles known as gunshot residue or GSR. These particles can be found on the hands, arms, and body of the person that fired a gun. During both of the boys' autopsies, these tests were performed, and in this case, there were positive gunshot residue findings involving both of the brothers. It could be argued, though, that GSR was transferred because of the two boys being near each other, but based on everything else that we've talked about, and we still have more to talk about, the investigators concluded that both brothers had handled and fired the weapon. What gunshot residue testing can't tell us, though, is the sequence of events. It cannot tell investigators who fired first or how much time passed between the two shots, or even where each brother was standing or sitting when the gun went off. It only means that both individuals were connected to the discharge of that same firearm. When the brothers were found, they were lying on their backs next to each other, again, with their legs straight and their arms extended outward. Attorney Daryl Mans, who was hired by the family, talked about his concerns regarding the way that the boys were both laying. He told CNN that the positioning appeared very unusual to him and raised questions about whether or not the scene may have been staged. He also pointed to the location of the gun being between Nazir's legs as something that seemed very inconsistent with what he would typically expect to see in a self-inflicted situation. Picture this. If someone's already lying on their back when the gun went off, their body may stay very close to how it was originally positioned because it couldn't fall or really even move anywhere after the injury. Someone who is sitting, kneeling, or even crouching could collapse in any number of directions depending on how they were positioned when the gun went off. So, let's think about where the gun should naturally fall. If I'm lying on my back, legs straight, left arm out, and my right arm falls outward with the gun, how did the gun fall between his legs? In my non expert opinion, I see what the attorney is saying. This, quite frankly, defies gravity. Despite that, though, according to the GBI, investigators examined the blood evidence, wound trajectories, and overall scene, and they insisted that the physical evidence was consistent with the positions in which the brothers were found. But the family and their attorney's concern about possible staging were a legitimate question to investigate, but the GBI ultimately decided that the evidence did not support the idea that the scene was staged by anybody. I searched everywhere that I could, but unfortunately, the complete toxicology reports for both brothers have not been made public. But investigators did find an unopened bottle of Fireball whiskey inside of the Nissan Altima. Because the bottle was unopened, it showed that alcohol from that bottle had not been consumed on the mountain, though. Today, the medical examiner's ruling remains the same, and that's that the official explanation for how Qaadir and Naazir Lewis died was that they took their own lives. The family strongly rejects this theory, and now we're going to get into the investigation. On Thursday, March 6th, 2 days before the boys were found, the twins were at their sister's house in Chamblee, which is about 20 miles away from Lawrenceville. They went back home from there, and their stepmom, Karini, confirmed that she did see both of them at the house on Friday evening, March 7th. They said goodnight, and then that was it. That was the last time she would see either of their boys alive. On the night of Friday, March 7th, the twins drove into a gas station near their home. Security cameras captured them putting gas into the black Altima, buying water and beef jerky, and then cleaning out the back seat of their car. A basketball rolled out of the car while they were cleaning it out, but they left it on the pavement and just drove away. The gas station footage is the last known footage of the boys alive that the investigators could find anywhere. As far as the actual crime scene at the Bell Mountain Summit goes, Qaadir again was found on his back, but he also had his blue and white anime sword laying over his torso, and he had a water bottle right beside him. Naazir was next to him, and his black and purple anime sword was found underneath his body. As we know, the weapon and spent shell casings were found near and between Nazir's legs, plus his iPhone and a Spirit Airlines ticket to go see his girlfriend were still in his pockets. Now, I did see some conflicting reports that stated that the plane ticket was found in the car, but I found even more sources that stated the plane ticket was in Nazir's pocket, and that he was the only one with a plane ticket, but I just wanted to mention that in case you've heard different accounts too. By the way, the spent shell casings only being by Naazir stood out to me as very unusual. Let me know if you found that strange as well. This wasn't addressed by the GBI theory either, by the way. There was also a red backpack found nearby, and inside of that backpack, they found a box of Nosler 45 cartridges or bullets, Qaadir's phone, and a notebook with a note that mentioned Journey to the Afterlife. That phrasing was eerie and concerning, and one of the reasons that the GBI felt the boys had done this to themselves. Inside of the Ultima in the parking lot, they also found a rope and the unopened fireball. As we've touched on a couple of times, Nazir had his flight booked for the morning of Friday, March 7th. This flight was scheduled to depart at 7 a.m. to Boston to go see his girlfriend, and he went to the airport that morning. GBI records and surveillance footage did confirm this. He was the only one with a ticket, and Qaadir had not booked a flight to go with his brother. Nazir didn't board the plane though because he actually missed his flight, so he went back home that morning instead. There's been a lot of confusing reporting on this, by the way, that both brothers had plane tickets, but I did confirm that only Nazir had a plane ticket. After Nazir got back home, he called his girlfriend and he told her that he missed his flight, but that he would rebook it for 7 a.m. the following morning, which was Saturday, March 8th, but that second flight never happened either. This is one of the pieces of the timeline that's been most heavily debated. I've seen some say that Nazir had an inkling that his brother was going to take his own life, so he decided to stay behind. I also saw another theory about an Uber driver driving both of the boys home from the airport, but we know that only Nazir was at the airport. Nonetheless, weigh in and let me know your thoughts down below. On the morning of Saturday, March 8th, the boys' stepmom woke up and found the house empty, so she assumed that Qaadir and Nazir had driven to the airport for that rebooked flight. When she walked into the kitchen, though, she found items on the counter. First was a camera, and second was a handwritten note from Nazir. He wrote, "Please return to my Uncle Rahim." The twins had borrowed their uncle's camera to take pictures of their new athletic clothing line that they'd been working on together. Now, at first, this note seems completely normal, but in hindsight, others have felt that this was wrapping up some unfinished business. The GBI accessed cell phone records for both of the brothers' phones, and using this, they reconstructed the full travel timeline from Lawrenceville to Bell Mountain. This drive was 90 miles from Gwinnett County north through the Georgia foothills and into Towns County. The GBI also cross-referenced the cell phone data against any existing surveillance cameras all along the points of the route. They looked into the gas stations, traffic systems, and commercial properties too. In every surveillance video and in every location, the Lewis brothers seemed to be alone. There was no third vehicle documented traveling with the Altima, and it didn't look like anyone was inside the car either. The boys also didn't stop to meet up with or pick anybody else up that day. Because of all of this context, the GBI felt that this established that the brothers had traveled alone to Bell Mountain and that they'd been alone ever since they left their house in Gwinnett County. Upon even further digging into the boys' phones, the investigators found that Nazir ordered those Nosler 45 cartridges and they were delivered to their house on March 5th, which was 3 days before they were found dead. That Garrison 45 handgun was also confirmed to be stolen from Powder Springs, and Nazir actually showed this weapon to his girlfriend in late February on FaceTime, saying that he had gotten this gun to protect himself and his brother. Even though we can't say for sure what Nazir was protecting himself from, we now have an eyewitness that confirmed that the boys did have this gun at least a couple of weeks, if not a month, before they passed away. When the police looked into Qaadir's phone, they also found something even more concerning. They found searches about the rates that people take their own lives, particularly in 2024, and then another search in general about taking your own life. Nazir's phone also contained searches for how to load a gun, and then he saved videos about firearms and being shot at. The family's response to this evidence, though, is that its existence doesn't answer the fundamental question of what happened on March 8th. To be clear, they don't feel that the searches or videos were made up by the police, and in fact, they don't dispute the GBI's findings. They just feel that the phone activity doesn't explain everything that happened and what they knew about their boys. The GBI found no physical evidence of a third party at the crime scene or in or around the car either. There was no foreign DNA, no footprints that didn't belong to the brothers, and nobody else at Bell Mountain that morning before those other hikers arrived. There were also no other cars besides the Altima on the route or in the parking lot. And last but not least, according to the GBI report, there was no physical evidence of a struggle or a confrontation at the scene after 10 weeks of investigation. Advocates, the family, and their attorneys still believe strongly that this could be a cover-up, and some have compared the twins' case to the Ahmaud Arbery case. If you remember his story, which I did cover it, initial law enforcement findings were overturned because of evidence that came out later. Despite all of this, the GBI's May 21st, 2025 ruling that the boys did this to themselves formally closed this investigation. GBI agents met with the Lewis family prior to it going public, right before they released it to the press. What was said in those meetings, we don't know, but according to their loved ones, the twins had no reason to take their own life, and they were not in that state of mind whatsoever. They were actively building and working on their own future. On June 6, 2025, the Lewis family held a press conference in Gwinnett County 2 weeks after the case was closed. Tyrese Lewis attended, but sadly, he had suffered from a stroke. This affected his speech, so his brother in law Nelson Harris read the written statement from Tyrese and Karini on the family's behalf. They described Qaadir and Naazir as intelligent, loving, funny, kind, respectful, ambitious, independent, and resilient young men who were driven and worked very hard towards their goals. Uncle Rahim, the uncle that the boys had borrowed the camera from, had been a consistent voice for the family, and he was also there at that June press conference. He said that he had never even seen the boys so much as fight, never saw them hurt one another, and the GBI theory didn't match whatsoever with the boys that he'd known all their lives. Everyone in the family felt that way. I want to continue diving into the family's points though, because according to them, these boys had no clear signs of crisis that anyone around them recognized. Nazir's girlfriend said that he was making plans and discussing marriage with her, and they were both in school and building their clothing line. Their stepmom knew all their habits, all their routines, and said that the drive didn't even make sense. The scene looked staged to the attorney, and they wanted an independent review. Nazir's girlfriend in Boston did talk about the struggles he was having, but his girlfriend said it was just typical life stress and not a crisis. If it came off as a crisis to her, she would have helped him get help. His family also didn't perceive this as a crisis either. The question in this case is whether or not the weight had shifted into something else between December and early March without any outward signs that his mental health was on the decline. The twins' stepmom knew them very well, and she made it clear that they were not hikers, and they were cautious about driving the Altima long distances. They had never been to Bell Mountain, and according to the family, had never even heard of it. The drive from Lawrenceville to Bell Mountain follows routes north and west through the Georgia mountains, which is about an hour and 45 minutes to 2 hours under normal traveling conditions. The landscape changes significantly along the way. In early March, the trees along the route are bare and the road narrows as it climbs toward the mountain. Bell Mountain's 2-mile access road is narrow and winding, designed for one direction of traffic at a time, which is not exactly the kind of car that you take that's always breaking down. Also, the summit parking lot sits at the edge of an exposed rocky plateau, and it isn't a safe place to be driving around in an unstable vehicle either. Now, to address the psychological aspect of this case, people in serious psychological crises can often appear fine to everyone who loves them, especially in men, statistically speaking. I know that there are several mental health experts here in our community, so please weigh in the comments. People suffering this way make plans, discuss the future, and they send messages that don't read as goodbyes. I can tell you this firsthand from a very recent devastating loss in my own family. The time right before that decision to go is made, they can seem very calm and almost relieved to have finally made the decision to go. This does not mean that the family's wrong to believe that their boys were okay, by the way. It means that the human mind can carry things that the people closest to it genuinely can't see. Both of those things are true, and they can coexist without canceling each other out. Something else I want to talk about are some concerning statistics, so let this be a reminder to be gentle with others and check in on the people in your life. The rate in which young Black men in the United States take their own lives has risen quickly and consistently over the past couple of decades. Research actually shows that Black youth and young adults aged 15 to 24 are one of the fastest growing demographics for mortality, and they're also the least likely to access mental health care. Do you see why this is so deeply concerning? The numbers are climbing, but the access or use of the resources simply isn't there. There's also a stigma around mental health within communities where expressing emotional pain is seen as weakness. The twins' father's stroke, financial strain at 19, and the pressure of being the person in the household who has to hold things down can be a lot to take, assuming that nothing nefarious happened to them at the hands of somebody else. If the official ruling is accurate, then Qaadir and Naazir Lewis could fall into this category, and that is alarming. In October of 2025, so about 5 months after the official case closure, CNN obtained and published basically the full case file. This released details about what was found at the crime scene, what was inside the Altima, the note on the counter, the FaceTime call with the gun, the anime swords, the girlfriend's full story, and the stolen weapon. It was the most complete public picture of the case up until that point, and it's still all we have to go off of today because the case is still closed. The twins' aunt, Yasmin Bronner, launched the GoFundMe campaign in March of 2025 for 2 reasons. First was to cover funeral and memorial expenses for the twins, And second was to fund hiring a private investigator that specializes in homicide and criminal cases. The family wanted an independent exam of the evidence outside of the GBI's jurisdiction. Unfortunately, we don't have any information regarding that private investigation at this time. Qaadir and Naazir Lewis were buried on March 28, 2025, in matching coffins in Atlanta, Georgia. They were only 19 years old, buried side by side. The Ding Dong twins were inseparable from the beginning, and they were also inseparable at the end. Even though these boys had been laid to rest and the investigation is closed, the family's questions are still not resolved. Their grief isn't either, and I don't know if the pain of this type of loss ever fully goes away. I pray that Qaadir and Naazir are resting peacefully and that their family has been able to find peace despite these tragic losses. Thank you so much for listening to their story and hanging out with me today. I had done some preliminary research on today's case, and a couple of weeks ago, there were a few of you asking about the twins in the comments, so I wanted to cover it based on what I already had. I do wish that the entire autopsy had been released, but let me know what your theories and thoughts are on today's case. Please make sure to be extra gentle towards yourselves and others and do something good for your mental health this week. Nurse's orders. Don't forget to drop me a butterfly in the chat if you made it to this point of the video, and I will see you next time.